This is Gene Shepard, and I'm reading from my novel, In God We Trust, All Others Pay Cash, that was published by Doubleday, and this is from their Dolphin edition. Its number is C486. And I'm going to read chapter 16, which is entitled Ludlow Kissel and the Dago Bomb That Struck Back. I threaded my way through the midtown midday sidewalk traffic that eddied and surged over and around the clutter of construction paraphernalia. It was desperately hot. My wash-and-wear suit clung to me like some rancid, scratchy extension of my clammy skin. All around me, New York was busily, roaringly, endlessly rebuilding itself like some giant phoenix arising from the still, red-hot ashes of its dead self. New York's infamous edifice complex booms mightily in midsummer. Building, building, eternally always building. I scuttled feverishly through shimmering waves of asphalt-scented heat toward the paradise of dark, expensive decadence of my favorite French restaurant, Les Miserables du Frites, little realizing that in another split second I was about to enjoy one of the truly secret subterranean pleasures of the human soul. Frantically taking my place in a hunched line of prickly heated city dwellers, doggedly plodding single file over a long planked gangway, tightly jammed between an enormous excavation and a line of throbbing bright orange engines of construction. Ahead of me, a short, stout lady wearing a damp flowered dress, clutching a Bonwit Teller shopping bag in both hands, ducked her head low as she ran interference for me and for those behind me through the wall of ringing sound and sensual heat. My mind, as is so often the case these days, was totally blank. Sweat trickled in a long, thin, cool line down the knobbles of my backbone and spread out damply along the waistband of my twisted jockey shorts, which were threatening to emasculate me at any moment. My feet moved steadily to the rhythm of a colossal diesel engine pounding insanely off my port bow. All around us, reaching high into the copper heavens, the stainless steel and aluminum green glass cliffs of partly completed and already eroding towers acted as colossal baffles, amplifying the subterranean reverberations of construction almost beyond endurance. New York's summer festival was in full swing, and I was a celebrant. I had reached perhaps the midpoint of the plank ladder, breathing shallowly of the rising clouds of pulverized cement dust and carbon monoxide fumes, a subtle mixture that forms one of the more insidious anesthetics yet devised, dulling the senses and clouding the soul when it happened. It was more felt at first than heard, a long, gurgling sensation, pushing up suddenly from the gut and exploding in the brain like some great comber of some ancient sea on a lost, forgotten beach. Grr-bloom, brum-boom. For a split second, the great sound hung in midair, and then, unthinkingly, my ancient GI reflexes worked magically and smoothly. I hurled myself down to the clapboard, digging in as I landed. The bombardment had begun. It was incoming artillery. I clung to the earth, waiting for the second round of the bracket, which should come, I hastily calculated, off to my right. Suddenly, I became aware of an insistent rapping on the back of my neck as an elderly, crane-like citizen behind me croaked, "Get up, you bum! If you're going to sleep on the sidewalk, at least find a doorway, you soak!" He stepped over me, and I sheepishly regained my feet. Up and down the line, I saw other ex-GIs brushing themselves off and once again moving forward in the unending stream of 20th century man bound for God knows where. My mind raced as I peered through the haze of the great canyon of excavation that lay just beyond the barricades, and then I could smell it. An acrid, faint, delicious, familiar, naggingly pleasing scent. Dynamite. The real thing. Minutes later, I sat pensively at a tiny corner of Miserables, waiting for my luncheon date to arrive and vaguely conscious of a difficult-to-define sense of nostalgic pleasure and euphoria. Could it be the Bloody Charlie I was drinking? No, I had barely touched it. as I idly and comfortingly fingered the smooth, sleek surface of my American Express card, my protection against the world, the way a gunfighter of old must have absently fondled his Smith & Wesson .38. I tried to analyze my sudden sense of warmth and well-being. This is an alien feeling for me these days. I tried to analyze it. It had started immediately after the blasting operation at the construction site. Could there be a connection? No man wants to admit that he's a secret atom bomb fan. So I hastily rejected that transient thought. Oh, no. Yet somehow I could not deny that the tiny whiff of blue smoke had awakened some ancient memory, some long-dormant pleasure. I absently munched one of the new no-cal composition cashew nuts, which are featured at the boîte, as I raked my memory for a clue. The pleasant sound of diners' voices mingled with the muzak and the popping of corks. The sizzling of the grill and the hum of air conditioning lulled me as the Bloody Charlie began its soothing work. Out of the din, voices and sounds of the past emerged, dripping ooze and slime like some ancient creatures unearthed from long-sealed caverns. Dynamite! Dynamite! Let's admit it. There are few sounds more soul-satisfying, more frightening, more exciting than an explosion. Explosions of one kind or another have always been part of great folk celebrations, from weddings to wars. I sipped my drink, and I mused on the first time that I'd heard that primal roar of exploding black powder. And then it hit me, my God! Of course! Tomorrow was the 4th of July! Huh. The 4th of July, it had crept up on tiny cat's feet on the scale of the calendar, unnoticed, unsung, unbombarded. It was then that I knew where those pleasant tinglings of mingled regret and exhilaration that we all call nostalgia had come from. Yes, in just a few hours it would be the glorious 4th, and here I was without so much as a sparkler to my name. I ordered another drink, and I settled down comfortably into my soft, eider-down bed of remembrances of things past. There are times when you just have to let it go. As I idly mauled the twin olives in my classical Charlie, the northern Indiana landscape of my youth began to take form, shadowy and persistent amid the green and gold bottles beyond the mirrored bar directly ahead of me, the blackened stumps, snaggle-toothed and primal, of the steel mills and the oil refineries lay etched against the hazy, gray-green horizon of the July skies of the Great Lakes. Somewhere off in the distance, the construction crew set off another dull, thumping blast that jiggled the silverware on my table, and it all began to come back. Dynamite, heat, and excitement were all intermingled in that 4th of July ritual that has long since departed. What is there about a solid, molar-rattling explosion that sets the blood a-tingle and brings the roses to the cheeks? There are muddle-headed souls who will tell you over and over that man is basically a peaceful and quiet creature, destined ultimately to while away his golden days strumming lutes, penning odes, and watching birds. I have never yet witnessed a turtle preparing to ignite the portentous fuse of an M18 cherry bomb. No way. No, it remained for man to concoct black powder from the innocent elements of the earth and ultimately to split the atom, all in pursuit of that healing bomb, the thunderous report. Kaboom! And nowhere was this particular pleasure more honored and indulged than in the mill towns of northern Indiana. Even today there are countless veterans of these fireworks barrages, hearing partially gone, a high, thin, singing sound in the cranium, sporting stunted, stubbly eyebrows, vaguely jumpy from borderline shell shock, who search in vain for the fireworks stand to assuage their deep hunger for the celebrating concussion, the better to honor our glorious American past. The fireworks stand. Even setting the words down, stark and simple on the page, causes my hands to tremble and my brow to dampen in delicious fear, the sort of fear that only a kid who has lit a 5-incher under a carnation can and has hurled himself prone upon the earth awaiting the end can know. Even the look of classical fireworks was magnificent. The 5-incher, hard, cool, rock-like cylinder of sinister jade green, its vicious red fuse, aggressive and yet quiet, cradled in the palm of the hand. It was an experience once known, never forgotten. The cherry bomb! Oh, what pristine geometric tensile beauty, a perfect orb. Brilliant carmine red, packed chock-a-block with latent terror and destruction. The torpedo. You remember those? An instrument malevolent and yet subtly complex, designed for hand-to-hand celebration. Many a grown man today carries in his shins a peppering of tiny round pebbles buried deep in the flesh from too close familiarity with the roaring torpedo, a shrapnel victim of the glorious Fourth. For the uninitiated, I, at this point, must explain that the torpedo, now here's what it was perhaps an inch high, a half-inch in circumference, symbolically striped in the colors of our glorious country, made to be hurled against a brick wall or a passing Hupmobile, a contact weapon of singular violence that sent its igniters, tiny rock fragments, showering over an area of 50 yards or more, a vicious little piece of business. And the pinwheel. What was the pinwheel? Well, an expensive device largely used for flamboyant show, and yet responsible for some of the major conflagrations of the past. Whole blocks, and indeed some cases entire towns, disappeared under the roaring flames to the applause of the multitude. I speak with more than average authority on these matters since my father, a genuinely dedicated fireworks maniac, owned and operated, get this, he owned and operated a fireworks stand every year during my larval stages. Oh, Lordy. The Depression lay over the land like a great numbing blanket of restlessness and frustration. But on the 4th, the sky would be filled with skyrockets, booming aerial bombs, and hand grenades, because nobody had anything else to do in those days. They could scratch, they could make beer, they could just stand around. Once in a while, they'd go down to the roundhouse and see if they could pick up an extra day somewhere. But mostly, they'd just sit on a porch, chew tobacco, and spit. That's what the Depression was. Now, one of the good things about the Depression, and why a lot of people look back on it with a nutty kind of nostalgia, is because nobody made it in the Depression. So nobody had a sense of guilt. Goofing off was just a natural thing to do. In the Depression, nobody did anything. It was a license to just fool around. And they fooled around big in those days. I remember guys sitting on their front porch tossing dynamite, now I mean blasting dynamite, out on the streets just for kicks. Northern Indiana was full of primal types who've drifted up from the restless hills of Kentucky and the gulches of Tennessee, bringing with them suitcases filled with dynamite, saved over from the time Grandpa blew up the stumps on the back 40. And they brought it to the city with them, because, of course, you never can tell. And since they never had any money for fireworks, there was only one thing to do, and they did it. They would sit on their porch on a quiet, hot 4th of July, rocking back and forth in the swing, breaking dynamite sticks, which come about 6 inches long, into sizes approximating a green 2-incher, just busting off a chunk like a Baby Ruth candy bar. Old Dad, his cigar clamped in his teeth, would scotch tape a little fuse at the end. Yeah, he would raise it with suitable flourishes to his cigar butt end, psst, hold it aloft for a split second to show off a little, flip it back by the garage, and dive for the floor. Kaboom! Old Roof is celebrating his ancient heritage. Crockery would crash for blocks around. Old ladies would be hurled into the snowball bushes, but no one seemed to care. After all, the 4th is the 4th. There would be a slight delay as Roof fused another nuclear bomb, and boom! Tin cups would rattle for miles around, windows shadow and smash. Dynamite was the milk of life to the average hillbilly of the day. He celebrated with it, feuded with it, and fished with it. Now, the sporting instinct runs strong in the hills of Kentucky. When the fishing season would open, the river would literally be aboil with TNT. Kaboom! An underwater explosion has its own peculiar excitement, a kind of long, drawn-out subterranean gurgle, and then the air for miles around would be filled with catfish, a thunder cloud of sunfish drifting over the county for 20 minutes or more, hundreds of the sporting elite fielding them in bushel baskets. Now, the more civilized celebrants, however, on the 4th, shot their relief check in one orgy of fireworks buying. Fireworks come in a number of exotically lethal varieties. Among them was the classical Dago bomb. Now, this was never construed as an anti-Italian name, meaning actually it was more pro than anything else. The Dago bomb was the ne plus ultra of the fireworks world, a true thing of beauty and symmetry. It came in several sizes, 4 to be exact: the 5-inch, the 8-inch, the 10-inch, and the sure death. In more effete circles, it was known as an aerial bomb, but among the real fireworks fans, it was most often known as the Dago Heister. It actually looked like these giant, non-existent firecrackers that occasionally show up in cartoons. A red, white, and blue tube with a wooden base stained dark green, a long red fuse, and instructions printed on the bottom. Quote, "Place upright in a clear, unobstructed area. After igniting, stand well back. Not recommended for children. The manufacturer assumes absolutely no responsibility for this device." End of quote. Now, theoretically, this infernal machine was to be lit by an expert hand. It would then explode with the first or minor explosion, which propelled an aerial charge of pure white TNT high into the ambient air, theoretically vertical, for several hundred feet, and then devastation. Oh, you've seen these things go off on fireworks displays, those great crashing roars from high in the sky, not once but several times, depending on the size of the Dago bomb in question. It was not cheap, the smallest going for about 50 cents and the largest for around $3, which in the days of the Depression was truly a capital investment in destruction. Now, the legends surrounding this mysterious weapon are countless. The mere sight of one of those larger specimens on the shelves of a fireworks stand sent waves of fear and nervous excitement to the sparkler buyers. It was truly the big time. When you bought one of these, you were saying something. And it was a Dago bomb that played a key role in the legend that was Ludlow Kissel. Ludlow Kissel had found his true medium in the Depression itself. Kissel worked in idleness the way other artists worked in clay or marble. God only knows what would have happened to him had there not been a Depression. He was a true child of his time. He was also a magnificent souse. The word alcoholic had not come into common usage, at least not in the steel towns of Indiana. Nor were there any lurking Freudian fears or explanations for the classical appetite for potage that Kissel nourished. He was a drunk. That was what he was, a drunk. And he knew it. He just liked the stuff and glommed onto it whenever the occasion demanded and when it didn't demand it. If the store-bought variety of lightning was not available, he concocted his own, using raisins, apricots, maybe a few dead toes, Fleischmann's yeast, molasses, and dead flies. Now, nominally, Kissel worked in the roundhouse. He called himself a railroad man, and for over 30 years he had been on what they call the extra board, being called in only in extreme emergencies, which occurred roughly once every other month or so. He invariably celebrated a day of work by holing up in the Bluebird for perhaps a week, and then he would return home, propelling himself painfully forward on one foot and one knee. He was compensating for a tilted horizon. The sound of Kissel crawling up the gravel driveway next to his house was a familiar one, and it took him sometimes upwards of 3 hours to make it from the street to the back porch. At 3 a.m., lying in my dark bedroom It was kind of comforting to hear Mr. Kissel struggling up the steps of his back porch, inching painfully step by step. Thump. 1, that's the first step. Long pause. Thump. 2, longer pause. Thump. He made it 3 in a row. Split-second pause. Dump, 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 thump, thump. He's back at the bottom. Poor old Kissel missed that step again. Many's the time I've slipped off to sleep with this familiar sound of brave human endeavor battling over overwhelming odds, Kissel trying to make the kitchen door. And then the voice of Mrs. Kissel, a large flower-print aproned lady who read true romances voraciously, would call out, "Watch the steps, Lud, they're tricky." She loved them. Kissel, one 4th of July, played a leading role in a patriotic tableau which is even today spoken of in hushed reverential tones in the area. It was a particularly steamy, yeasty, hellish July. The houseflies clung to the screen doors, and the mosquitoes hummed in great whirling clouds in the poplar trees. It was in such weather that Mr. Kissel reached his apogee. He was not a winter souse. There was something about the birds and the bees and the hot sun that sent off a spark in Mr. Kissel's blood and stoked an insatiable thirst for the healing grape. His stocky, overalled figure reading through the twilight, leaving a wake of flickering fireflies, was as much a part of the summer landscape as the full golden moon. Parishioners sprinkling their lawns and snowball bushes would nod familiarly to him as he wove through the fine spray of their brass nozzles. The 4th in question dawned, hot and jungle-like, with an overhang of black, lacy storm clouds. In fact, a few warm, immense drops sprinkled down through the dawn haze. I know, because I was up and ready for action at dawn. Few kids slept late on the 4th. Even as the stars were disappearing and the sun was edging over the lake, the first cherry bombs cracked the stillness, and the first old ladies dialed the police. Carbon cannons, which had gathered dust in basements for a year, roared out, greeting the dawn. And by 7 a.m., the first dozen pairs of eyebrows were blackened and singed, and already the wounded were being buttered with unguentine and sent back into the fray. Long lines of overheated Willie's Knights, Essex, and Pierce arrows inched toward the beaches. Babies cried, mothers wept, and husbands swore. Parades fitfully broke out, and the White Sox prepared to battle with the St. Louis Browns, futility meeting hopelessness head on. The sun rose higher and higher, and at its zenith blazed down with an intensity of purpose and effectiveness equal to its best work in equatorial Africa. The asphalt simmered quietly and stuck to the tires and the tennis shoes of the passing parade. Lilac bushes drooped fragrantly, and the cicadas screamed from the cottonwoods. Through it all, the steady, rolling barrage of exploding black powder in one form or another paid homage to our War of Independence. As the day wore on, the barrage grew in intensity, because all true fireworks nuts learned from infanthood the art of rationing and husbanding the ammunition for the crucial moment which came always after dark. Kissel had not made his appearance throughout the long morning and early afternoon. He was undoubtedly stoking his private furnace in preparation for his gala, which, when it came, was worth waiting for. Shortly after noon, a few drops of rain sprinkled down, just enough to dampen the shirt and the rose bushes, but not the spirits. Little did we realize that we were shortly to be the observers of a scene that would be discussed and recounted through the long winter months of years to come. The event became known simply as Kissel's Dago bomb. The White Sox and the Brownies had painfully worked their way into the top of the 3rd of the first game, a scoreless tie, when Kissel appeared on the shimmering horizon, weaving spectacularly and carrying a large paper bag as carefully as a totally committed drunk can. Kissel was about to celebrate the founding of our nation, the nation which had provided such a bounteous life for him and his. At first no one paid much attention to the struggling figure as it inched its way from lamppost to lamppost and fireplug to fireplug. Little girls burned sparklers on porches, and I was carefully depleting a string of Chinese ladyfingers. Now, these are tiny firecrackers with pleated fuses all woven together and designed for the rich and profligate to fire off simultaneously by simply lighting the main fuse. Oh, let me tell you, no kid in his right mind ever did that. But instead, we carefully disengaged fuse by fuse the ladyfingers and fired them off one by one under garbage cans, on porches, and behind dogs. My mother, at regular intervals, called from the kitchen window the 4th of July watch cry of all mothers. Be careful! You're going to lose an eye if you're not careful. Be careful! This was, of course, purely ritualistic. It was only a minor annoyance. Flick had already suffered a flesh wound of a routine nature. His right hand was swathed in grease-soaked gauze, the result of demonstrating that he actually could hold a 3-incher in his hand when it went off and still survive. He was now back on the scene working as a lefty. In short, it was a fourth like all fourths, up to the moment that Kissel took his stance, his historic stance. He had disappeared into his house to prepare for his massive statement of patriotism. Shortly afterward, he reappeared on the front porch. He stumbled down the steps, carrying in his right hand the largest Dago bomb that had ever been seen in the neighborhood, if not the state. It was a Dago heister of truly awesome nature, being fully 1.5 feet high and a good 3 inches in diameter. It was the first all-black Dago bomb anyone had ever seen. Now, this point has been argued for many a cold, wintry afternoon. Now, some reports have it that Kissel's Dago bomb was not a Dago bomb at all, but some sort of mortar shell. Others maintain that it was indeed a Dago bomb, but of a foreign make, possibly Chinese, as the somber, menacing color was highly unorthodox. Suffice it to say that no one ever really determined just where Kissel obtained this weapon, or its true nature, as Kissel himself was hazy on most details of his life, and this was no exception. His only comment later, which was never disputed, was, "I sure got one." Well, when Kissel emerged from the front door and came down the steps carrying his work of the devil, the neighborhood almost magically knew that something big was about to happen. Sparklers flickered out. Kids ran through vacant lots and over driveways. Heads appeared at windows. The crowd gathered. Kissel, with that peculiar deliberateness of the perpetually fog-bound, laboriously prepared to detonate the Black Beauty. He placed it dead in the center of the concrete road and stood back to survey the scene, waving slightly as he worked. The crowd drew back and watched, silently, excitement hanging over the multitude in the thin blue haze. Fireworks of that magnitude rarely, if ever, were seen, and commanded instant respect. The ebony monster stood bolt upright, silently, with a cool quality of the truly lethal, understated but potent. Shimmering waves of heat caused the scene to take on a strange, unreal, flickering quality. The neighborhood fell silent, and only the dull mutterings of distant fire barrages broke the stillness. A few errant drops of tepid rain sprinkled the concrete as we waited. The skies overhead were gray and threatening, with ragged edges of black clouds shimmering in the July heat. Kissel, at center stage, struggled to find a match the way drunks invariably do, going through pocket after pocket after pocket, fumblingly, maddeningly, and finding only pencil stubs and brass keys. It seemed to go on forever, until finally someone, this point later was also in dispute, no one quite knew who actually handed him the book of matches, solved the problem. Kissel took the book of matches in hand, paused for a moment, and belched. A deep, round, satisfying, shuddering burp of the sort that can only come from a vast, internal, bubbling lake of green beer. The crowd applauded this tremendous burp and shifted impatiently, all eyes riveted on the dull black menace that stood with such dignity in the center of the concrete roadway. Finally, Kissel struck a match, which instantly went out. He struck another. It, too, flickered and died. Another, and another. There was, I might add, a slight breeze which puffed fitfully from the northwest. The audience grew restive, but no one dared leave. In fact, more viewers of this historic event were arriving by the minute. Kissel, as is so often the case with the massive drunk, seemed totally unaware of the drama he was creating, and with maniacal intensity he struggled with his match, lighting match after match from the book. Suddenly, from out of the crowd, a kid darted, an experienced detonator of high explosives of all sorts, who shoved into Kissel's palsied hand a stick of smoldering punk. The kid, according to witnesses who testified later, uttered one word, "Here," and then turned and scurried back into the throng and into the pages of local folk history forever. Kissel, thinking at first that he had been given a cigar, gazed at it numbly for a moment or two, and then dimly perceived that there was here means of lighting the fuse of this colossal black Dago bomb. The fuse on this type of insanity is the coated variety, and in this case was about 3 inches long, a black, stiff, powder-impregnated length of fiber. It doesn't take much to light them. And let me tell you, once lit, the die, brother, is cast. Kissel shuffled forward, punk in hand, and made several futile passes at the fuse, the magnificent bomb remaining aloof and cool throughout. With each pass, the crowd retreated, and then, with the inevitability of Greek drama, in the muttering silence, the telltale hiss sounded forth, clear and unmistakable. The fuse was lit! Immediately, the assemblage rolled back in a mighty wave, turned and waited while Kissel continued to attempt to light the fuse, totally unaware that time was growing short. Someone called out, "Kissel, hey, Kissel, for God's sakes, it's lit!" Kissel raised his head questioningly and said, "What's lit, huh? The ominous hiss continued, and then suddenly and without warning, it stopped. Occasionally, these fuses are tricky and extremely dangerous. They have been known to lie dormant like this for hours, seemingly extinguished for no good cause. Obviously, this black menace was one of the treacherous ones. Kissel returned to his fight, again touching punk to fuse, and this time the fuse, in its unpredictable way, hissed frantically. Kissel, at last seeing that the monster was lit, attempted his getaway. He reeled in a half circle, befuddled, trailing punk smoke behind him, and then, staggering forward, knocked the black monster over on its side, hissing fiercely with only seconds remaining. The crowd, seeing this catastrophe unreeling before its eyes, to a man hit the dirt. Those on the fringes dove into snowball bushes. Others simply moaned piteously and dug in. It was good training, as events turned out, for later years for most of them. The Dago bomb lay on its side, its ugly snout pointing toward the houses, which lay across the lawns 200 feet or so away. Cooler members of the crowd shouted to those in the houses, "Look out! It's coming! Close your windows! Look out!" The fuse sputtered on. Kissel himself, now aware of the nature of the rapidly approaching catastrophe, made a futile but certainly courageous attempt to right the bomb. He tried to right it up. Someone yelled, "Get down, Kissel! You'll get killed!" Kissel fell over backward and lay, flattened out on the concrete, waiting for the call of his maker. He knew his end had arrived. And then it happened. There are events which lend themselves readily to the descriptive phrase, the words of pen or tongue. And then there are others which happen that cannot be adequately communicated. And the moment of Kissel's Dago bomb must be classified as one of the truly indescribable. Suffice it to say that the bomb was well made and of an order of efficiency that fireworks manufacturers rarely achieve. With a definite, clipped, stinging report, bap! The aerial bomb, lying horizontally on its side, propelled its deadly cartridge of dynamite out along the earth, skipping, humming, singing in an instantaneous trajectory that struck terror into the very marrow of the bones those who were fortunate enough to be on the scene. The Dago bomb was obviously designed to send its aerial charge at least 500 feet in the air. This baby was moving. For an instant or so, we were not aware of what sort of aerial charge it was prepared to deliver. We soon found out. The cartridge, which seemed abnormally large as it emerged from the black maw of Kissel's folly, skimmed over the sidewalk, parting the spectators like the Red Sea, over the lawn, over the driveway, and with a sharp, audible click and whistling sizzle under Kissel's front porch. And for a long, pendulous moment, the universe stood still. Fingernails clawed the earth, heads burrowed into hedges. Kabroom! The first thunderous explosion rocked the neighborhood. The slats of Kissel's porch bellowed outward. The floor tilted instantly downward. A great yellow swirling cloud of dust rose over the lilac bushes. A second or two passed as an eternity, and then another and louder detonation thundered over the landscape. Boom! This time it caved in the rose trellis of the house next door to Kissel's. The crowd heaved and dug deeper as two more giant explosions, karaboom, boom, sounded almost as one, these two under Mr. Strickland's Pontiac. A heavy cloud of dust swirled for a moment, and all was still, except for the pattering of the quiet raindrops. Kissel slowly pulled himself to his knees and made his statement, which even today is part of the legend. My God, that was a doozy. Kissel had said it for all of us. As the crowd slowly got to its feet amid the quiet tinkling of glass and the heavy, sensual smell of oxidized dynamite, they were aware that they had been witness to history. I idly stirred my third Bloody Charlie as off in the middle distance another muffled blast baloomphed and jiggled the bottles behind the bar. Kissel faded into his historic landscape, and I pensively chewed a cashew nut as I vainly struggled to return to the here and now. After all, fireworks, we all know, are dangerous and childish playthings that have no place in the hard-hitting, on-the-go male life of today. A passing cab sent a reflected shaft of light across the mirror behind the bar. It broke into 1,000 colors amid the bottles, and subtly I was reminded that Kissel's like will never be seen again. He walked off quietly into history and was never heard from that day to this.